was only a matter of some weeks ago that the world at large woke up to the fact that something was in the air. It had no smell, no taste, it couldn't be seen, it made no noise, yet its potential was lethal. What was in the air, of course, was radiation, levels of which were rising far above the safety margins. And it soon became evident that the worst nuclear accident ever had occurred at Chernobyl in Russia. While writing the congregation in Ephesus, an observation was made by the Apostle Paul about levels of contamination. He had noticed that these levels were rising in his days, and he saw these as a source of spiritual contamination. Something was in the air. That's why we're interested in the Apostle Paul's definition and assessment of what was in the air. And in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, we soon find out what that was, as expressed by Paul, where he says, or, interestingly, it could almost be synonymous with the term air, or the inclination, the spirit of disobedience that permeates and influences the lives of worldly people. Of course, there's no doubt about it as to the source of this spiritual contamination. It does emanate from Satan himself, and it has a deadly effect on humans who absorb it. This frame of mind, this inclination of mind, this persistent tendency that controls the world of mankind must be avoided by us, because it moves the world to certain characteristic conduct, to speak, to think, to take certain attitudes and viewpoints. It moves individuals, and it moves mankind en masse to decide and to act in a certain way that destabilizes mankind. Some have called the Chernobyl fallout the Chernobyl cocktail, with its radioactive caesium and its radioactive iodine. But what a cocktail of contamination comes from the ruler of the air of this world. Its contents: aggressiveness, greed, corruption, permissiveness. Did it contaminate us? Did it have an effect upon us at one time? It would be foolish to deny the obvious answer and conclusion to that question, as observed in these words of Paul. And he says this in verse 3 of Ephesians 2. Yes, among them we all at one time conducted ourselves in harmony with the desires of the flesh, doing the things willed by the flesh and the thoughts, and we were naturally children of wrath, even as the rest. It was the ruler of the air and the spirit operating in the sons of disobedience that had this deadly effect. We were geared up to disobedience to God, and we were moved by that deadly cocktail of aggression, greed, corruption, and permissiveness. That deadly cocktail, breathed in by us, rendered us dead in God's sight. However, Jehovah knows too what's in the air. He has accurately assessed the levels of contamination, and he knows the source. And he recognizes that levels of contamination are now intensifying. And not only that, he has his own cocktail of denunciations and countermeasures. Can you find encouragement in his measures for decontamination? I'm sure you can. And you would like to check them in Revelation chapter 16 and verses 17, 18, and 21. Notice Jehovah's cocktail here. And it tells us in verse 17, and the seventh one poured out his bowl, where? Upon the air. And moving to verse 18, and lightnings and voices and thunders occurred, and a great earthquake occurred. In verse 21, and great hail with every stone about the weight of a talent descended out of heaven upon the men. And the men blasphemed God due to the plague of hail, because the plague of it was unusually great. What a cocktail. Are you impressed with Jehovah's countermeasures? Notice there, a shaking of this system produced by this deadly atmosphere to its very destruction. Condemnatory messages already poured out through the remnant, and before the end, a total denunciation will herald its destruction. That'll fix them, won't it, brothers? But are you impressed by Jehovah's measures for decontamination personally? Do you notice the expression lightnings? Lightnings, yes, great flashes of spiritual light which provide a regenerating effect from that produced by the spirit of the air. Well, if we are impressed, do we constantly allow them to keep us decontaminated spiritually, helping us to avoid this death-dealing air? Well, there's a great need to be sure that we are doing that. And to be sure, we would need to understand certain vital connections. Let's put these connections together in Ephesians 4 verses 22 to 24. And with no difficulty, the Apostle Paul has already done that for us. That you should put away the old personality, which conforms to your former course of conduct, and which is being corrupted according to his deceptive desires. And that you should be made new in the force actuating your mind, and should put on the new personality, which was created according to God's will in true righteousness and loyalty. Now, do you see the connection between the old personality and the air? Yes, in verse 22 he connects it up, and he's really saying that the old personality was fashioned according to the air, which shaped our former course of conduct. Now, verse 23, notice the need for a new motivating force to supplant that old spirit. And verse 24 gives us a connection. And what is that connection between the new force, Jehovah's Spirit? Why, it's this. That new spirit produces great changes in us. We put on the new personality. We're freed from pollution and defilement. We're able to walk contrary to the system, and even to be protected from any recontamination, that is, if we keep absorbing Jehovah's holy, pure spirit. Why do you think we raise the subject again under our heading, Avoid This World's Death-Dealing Air? Well, it's simply this, and it's sad. Since we met here last year, since we sat in this stadium, some have succumbed to that death-dealing air. And we even have to ask, what about next year? Will you and I be standing here, sitting here together? Will we have succeeded in avoiding this death-dealing air, which will continue to intensify? And there again, perhaps, if we honestly assessed ourselves now, we might just have to admit that the air of this world is affecting us to some extent. Never forget, brothers, that the air of this world is spiritually corrosive. Just reflect on that expression of the Apostle Paul when he said that you should put away the old personality. You know, in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 9, he puts it much more forcibly. He says, strip off the old personality. Now I wonder, have you ever had to strip off layer upon layer of old paint with a scraper? You know the problem. You just get one layer off, and there's another layer below. And what about all the stubborn bits? And what happens after a while? Well, you tend to get a bit fed up, don't you? You just rough it down a bit with sandpaper, and then you stick a coat of gloss over the top. And it looks all right, doesn't it? However, stripping off the old personality is rather like that. These personality structure layers that we have within us are ingrained by imperfection. Now, did you and I really get to work removing and obliterating these old personality layers by means of these flashes of enlightenment and the help of God's Spirit? Or did we get tired after a bit working at some of these stubborn areas and in the end just gloss over that area? Well, what happens if you leave old layers of paint underneath and you put a gloss coat over the top, if you don't strip away the old paint? Well, you can be sure that the air and the chemicals in the air, after some time, will make the new coat of paint blister and flake off and expose these old paint layers below. The new coat may, of course, last for a little while, but eventually this will happen. The polluted and corrosive air of this system will do the same with our new personality. If we've not really removed these old personality layers, it will make it blister and flake off and expose the old personality layers, and they'll come to the fore again. The aggressive spirit of the world will come in contact with our old aggressions that we left behind and that were left there. The permissive spirit will find old inclinations long subdued, but just hidden below the surface. These old inclinations will be stimulated again. The things in which we once walked will influence us again, and the system could just reclaim us for its own. Wee whiffs here and wee whiffs there of this contaminated air could be just enough to raise a blister. And you know what the ruler of the air will do with that blister? He'll work on it and work on it, work on that exposed area until it becomes a sore. So can you see the wisdom of Ephesians chapter 4, 22 to 24? It is saying in effect to you and I, make sure that the top coat of your personality is not a gloss over. Make sure it remains intact. Don't let it blister. Then nothing of this world's air will penetrate, causing us spiritual harm. And whatever we do, keep working on the stubborn bits. However, we do have to be realistic. We know that everything in this world is contaminated by that air. When we're at work, whatever might be presented before us as reading material, the entertainment of the world, that air's all around about us. So our situation then is something like being in a waiting room where there are no smoking and smoking sections. Properly, we're in the no smoking section, and we would say that that is our spiritual paradise. But whiffs of smoke continually drift past in our direction. Now, might we keep putting our heads out of our spiritual compartment to get whiffs of this contaminated air? Well, if you've ever been a cigarette smoker, you'll know that cigarette smoke has a habit of desensitizing people's taste buds and their sense of smell. Constantly breathing in the foul air of this system spiritually could make us less sensitive to what is a bad smell or a foul taste of some obnoxious attitude or act. We could swallow down more readily what is unwholesome, and we could get defiled. Just notice how a person becomes desensitized by the air of the system. Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 17 to 19 tells us just how that process goes on, doesn't it? The Apostle Paul doesn't miss this one out. And he says, "This therefore I say and bear witness to in the Lord, that you no longer go on walking just as the nations also walk, in the unprofitableness of their minds, while they are in darkness mentally, and alienated from the life that belongs to God, because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the insensibility of their hearts, having come to be past all moral sense, they gave themselves over to loose conduct, to work uncleanness of every sort with greediness." So that's how it happens. People go on walking in unprofitable ways. They make a practice of it. Their hearts are insensitive to Jehovah's ways. And once they get past any moral sense, their consciences become seared, and they go on to greater degrees of uncleanness and depravity, wanting more and more to satiate their corrupt desires. Do you think sometimes, brothers, maybe it's true that we don't quite understand? We're maybe a little bit insulated in the truth. We don't quite understand the low sink of this system of things, that it is now reaching an all-time low in its moral standards. And that's, of course, coming about by people breathing in this air. Do you know, recently a report said that all violent crime in this country was up 72%. That's staggering, isn't it? They even call London now the boy prostitution centre of the world. It's depravity, isn't it? Or maybe, you know, we just wouldn't rush out into the world, the atmosphere, and get involved in debauchery. We might refuse outright any proposal to commit fornication. But how do we react, or would we react, if someone of the opposite sex began to flirt with us, offering us personally complimentary speech, even touching us improperly? You see, would we respond in such a way as to encourage such conduct? And suppose it persists, like whiffs of contaminated air blowing our way. Will we start to succumb? Will these layers of the old personality surface and respond? Remember, every time you respond to such enticements, conscience barriers go down, and it makes the next indiscretion that bit easier. That's the process of desensitization at work, gradually numbing our consciences to the fresh, pure stimulus of God's Holy Spirit. Touching and allowing to be touched in a wrong way is a form of communication. It can inform the other person of our feelings without a word being spoken. Just purely by touching, relationship can take a great stride forward. Surely we want to avoid such eroding influences from the spirit of this world. Surely we don't want to lose our sensitivity to the clean, pure, moral atmosphere that Jehovah God provides. At this point, we would like to call in Brother Crozier, who is an elder in the Sunderland Roker congregation, and Brother Crozier and I are going to have a little discussion here on the basis of some of these principles in the book of Ephesians, which properly applied will help us to avoid this death-dealing air. Brother Crozier, I'm sure you would agree with me that one of the ingredients of this deadly cocktail of this contaminating air that we're talking about must be greed. And greed is an insatiate desire for more and more. Now let me project a little situation, quite common, we often talk about it. If we at present, say, are seeking a better job or advanced education, and our motive is to have more and more material advantage, do you think personally that we would stand in jeopardy of being contaminated by the air of this world? Could we have your views on that?
Well, yes, indeed. We certainly could, and possibly more than simply being tainted by the spirit of this world could be involved. In fact, the Apostle Paul gives us some indication that there is a spiritually corrosive dimension involved here. If we have a look at Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 5, he highlights this very well when he says, "For you know this, recognizing it for yourselves, that no fornicator or unclean person or greedy person," which means being an idolater, "has any inheritance in the kingdom of the Christ and of God." The Apostle Paul here is helping us to appreciate that greed for more and more actually becomes idolatry. This is because greed really amounts to worshipping money if we are endeavoring to get more and more of it. And eventually the effect is that Jehovah our God is squeezed out of our life and is then subtly replaced by this new God.
So wouldn't you agree, brothers, that that's an aspect of contamination by the air of this world that we would want to avoid at all costs? verse 29, Brother Crozier says, let a rotten saying, this is of chapter 4 by the way, let a rotten saying not proceed out of your mouth, but whatever saying is good for building up, as the need may be, that it may impart what is favorable to the hearers. Now, could we have your comments on that? Can you alert us to any aspect that that principle suggests where we could take the avoiding action?
Yes, this principle of not letting a rotten saying proceed out of our mouths really would directly apply to the coarse and vulgar type of speech that is very prevalent in our society today. This would be very unfitting for Christians. But also, we must say that it would also include things like crude toilet slogans, car stickers, and t-shirts that have subtle innuendos on them. These too would be encompassed by this principle.
We certainly don't want to advertise the world's vulgarities, do we, brothers? So there's an aspect to that deadly cocktail that we want to just avoid there. Now, how about Ephesians 4 and verse 31? There's a principle for us to consider. And of course, the way the Apostle Paul expresses it, he's showing that many people were affected by the contamination that this brings when he says, let all malicious bitterness and anger and wrath and screaming and abuse of speech be taken away from you, along with all badness. Now, to my mind, that's summed up in one word, aggressiveness. Any comments on that, Brother Crozier?
Well, yes, as we get deeper into the time of the end now, we find that there are new levels of aggression. Even in everyday situations, people are acting in savage ways. For example, on the road, we find that there are a new breed of aggressive young drivers. Many of these are influenced by drugs. They drive souped-up cars and bikes, which really is an expression of their aggressiveness. And wouldn't it be sad if any of our Christian youths were to act in such a way, to drive aggressively and perhaps annoy people in their neighborhood? That would certainly detract from the good name of the Christian congregation.
So once again, I'm sure the brothers will consider that, and our younger ones as well, and take the avoiding action. Shall we move to another principle here, verse 28 of Ephesians 4, where it says, let the stealer steal no more, but rather let him do hard work, doing with his hands what is good work, that he may have something to distribute to someone in need. Now, that does touch on some aspects within this modern world. People tend to view work and work payment in a certain way. Perhaps you would like to comment on that, Brother Crozier.
Yes, when we think of work, we have to say that in today's economic climate, unfortunately, many of our brothers are unemployed. But really, in such a situation, they would still have to be careful about their attitude towards work, because we could be influenced by the spirit of the world to not take a job that is suitable for us just because the money is not as much as that we're getting on unemployment benefit. And also in this area, if we were unemployed and we found ourselves in the situation of being able to take an interim job, then really we would have to be very careful that we didn't tend to skirt around declaring the money that we received from that job, so as not to have this worldly attitude towards work.
So that's a helpful point. We're glad you mentioned that, so we'll take note of that as another area to avoid and watch the corroding influence of the air doesn't get at us there. Now, how about Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 18? I think sometimes we often mention this principle with a little tongue-in-cheek, but it says also, do not be getting drunk with wine, in which there is debauchery, but keep getting filled with spirit. We notice there the contrast of the debauched spirit of the world and Jehovah's pure spirit. Now, Brother Crozier, Where do you think, with that principle in mind, we have to be especially careful about imbibing the wrong kind of spirit?
Well, I think to answer that question, really we could just mention what one newspaper had to say about a new low sink of debauchery. It had this to say: we're not talking about Soho, but about pubs and theatres and clubs up and down the country. Now, this report was in connection with what it termed hypnosex. Apparently, people in such places as are mentioned in the report are being hypnotized and then being made to perform all kind of lewd acts under hypnosis. So this certainly illustrates to us that the dangers in visiting such places are becoming greater and greater. And it helps us to see that as brothers and sisters, we would have to be very careful about going to such places for entertainment and relaxation. In fact, we must say that the places that we are able to go for relaxation nowadays and feel comfortable as Christians are becoming fewer and fewer. And so really the wisdom of being in these places would be very seriously questioned if we couldn't feel comfortable as a Christian.
Well, thank you, Brother Crozier, for alerting us to some of these dangerous areas, and I think the brothers would agree. We'll watch out for these, won't we, brothers, and watch that the air of this system is not eroding and corroding our spirituality there. Thank you, Brother Crozier. So there are some of the death-dealing ingredients of the concoction for spiritual deaths manufactured by Satan. He'll see to it that this foul air is wafted regularly and persistently in our direction. We can be sure of that. The question is, will we succeed in avoiding it? Why not inhale? Why not breathe in the good advice of Ephesians chapter 5 and verses 7 to 9? This will help us to take the avoiding action. For do not become partakers with them. For you were once darkness, but now you are light in connection with the Lord. Go on walking as children of the light. For the fruitage of the light consists of every sort of goodness and righteousness and truth. So how does that waft across to you, brothers? Does it say to you, keep allowing the spiritual light of truth to enclose you in your spiritual paradise and to keep you totally separate from those contaminated by that air? Well, if it does, that's fine, because that surely must be our attitude. Only then will we avoid this world's greed, its aggressiveness, its corruption, and its permissiveness. Only then will we avoid that death-dealing cocktail that Satan has manufactured. Staying inside our spiritual paradise will preserve intact the resilient spiritual coating of our new personality. Avoiding the corrosive atmosphere of this world, not deliberately exposing ourselves to it, will keep us pure, untarnished, spotless, unblemished, and ready for life everlasting in the pure atmosphere of the new system of things to come.